People. Huzzah. Aha, we have people. Hello. Yes, indeed. Well, technically, what's the time now? Technically, we're beginning in 50 seconds, but I thought I'd get the initial stream up and running. So I was just having a bounty bar. Oh yeah, my normal big glass is in the wash, so there is the goblet of destiny. So yes, we are about 15 seconds away from our scheduled start-up time. So now, how is the audio, everybody? Can you hear me? In theory, you should be able to hear me. Cool. Audio could be a little louder. Let's see if I can fix that. This is the advantage of starting fractionally early. Manage sound mode. Sound control panel. Ah, that'd be why. How's that? Hopefully it should be a little bit louder now. I found the sound control settings had turned up down the feed down to 90, which I have no idea why it had done that, but there you go. Right. Okay. So. Welcome everybody to the slightly delayed Drydock episode 109 live segment. Technically should have been last Friday, but as some of you will know, I was streaming with World of Warships, and then immediately after that I went off into a recording session for bilge pumps. So yeah, I did something like 6 hours of constant talking, by which point it was midnight UK time and I was very tired and my voice had died, so we're doing it today instead. As hopefully if you're regular tuners in to the show, you will know that this is where I answer the various alternate history, what if style questions from the Patreon questions for this past month, that being August, and then we'll get into picking questions from the stream, etc. So we'll see how all that goes. Hopefully as normal. So just to emphasize, if you do have questions, I will take them from the chat, but if you ask them now, I probably will never see them because it'll just get completely lost. So let's have a go. And I also know there's someone out there, I can't remember off the top of my head who it is, but there's somebody out there who heroically puts timestamps to these streams. So whoever you are out there, thank you very, very, very much. And if you want to drop me an email at some point, I'll be sure to send you out something as a token of my gratitude. So let's get on with these Patreon questions, shall we? And as always, the stream will run basically until I run out of Iron Brew, which means I'll run out of voice. Matt Osborne asks, which navies have used green hull paint, when, where and why, and how did red achieve global hull paint colour supremacy? Green hull paint is found in a few navies. The French and the Italians certainly used it. The Austro-Hungarians, I think, used it at points as well. As for why, it basically comes down to the constituent chemicals that make up the hull paint. Because remember, the hull paint is primarily there to act as a poison to deter-kill various marine life that is not welcome, such as barnacles. and so the colour is largely dictated by the chemicals that are used in that paint. The red colour obviously being the indicator of the most common chemicals used, but occasionally there are mixes with green, and to be honest, these days you can either through pigments or through a wide variety of industrial artificial chemicals, you can get hull paint in almost any colour, although a sort of a reddish orange tinge is still the main one that's used. Chris Gregory asks, what is your favourite moment from naval history when, due to human error, hubris, or just bad luck, things have gone wrong in the most amusing way possible? Favourite oh dear moments from naval history? Most of mine tend to be ones that usually have some rather fatal consequences for one side or the other, as opposed to amusing consequences. If you want to go with amusing consequences, I would probably say Moltke actually has to get a good shout in there, because in pretty much the one major attempt the High Seas Fleet made to go after the Grand Fleet after Jutland, everything was going relatively swimmingly until literally one of Moltke's screws fell off. You can just imagine that. I'm sure that was attached to us when we left the dockyard, and I don't think this is an expendable item, but yeah, oh dear. Time to reevaluate our concerns. So yes, that was quite an amusing one. There's also the rather wonderful kamikaze attack on HMS Sussex, which has shown up quite a few times on various corners of the internet, where a Japanese aircraft came in nice and low and fast, slammed into HMS Sussex's belt armour, and left an almost Wile E. Coyote style burnt silhouette on the armour plate, and that was pretty much that. So yeah, I suspect for a lot of the Sussex crew, the oh dear moment came from when they saw a kamikaze slam into their side, having got through their air defence, and then the amusing part was when they looked over the side and like, oh, is that all they do then? Christopher Hamilton asks, a few weeks ago someone asked you about icebreaker battleships. Oh wow, okay, this is going to be an interesting one. And that made me think of a Star Trek Enterprise episode where Shran, an Andorian, played by the excellent Jeffrey Combs, by the way, who is an absolute pleasure to talk to when I've met him at a Star Trek convention up in Birmingham, and criminally underappreciated actor. Anyway, he states that his ship was named after the first icebreaker to circumnavigate Andorra. Presumably that'd be the Kumari then. Implying that Andorra at least has significant ice flows even at the equator. So that made me wonder how that affects Andorran seagoing ships of various ages. I suspect you probably wouldn't see any until they get to the era of steam and iron, for the very good reason that, well, as Erebus and Terra and Ernest Shackleton's ship found, wooden sail-powered ships do not make the best icebreakers. So yeah, I suspect that the flip side to that is that you probably would have seen a lot of more land-based expeditions along the ice flows, and then yeah, once the era of steam and iron - steam and steel got going, that would be when they'd get icebreakers up and running. Trevorius asks, and I should probably widen this so I can actually read these questions a bit better. Trevorius asks, if the US got really excited over Billy Mitchell's tests, maybe they allow aerial torpedoes and get a decisive result that way, and collectively decide that aircraft carriers are the way of the future, what do the next 20 years look like? Probably worse for the US Navy, to be perfectly honest, because they're still going to be restricted by the treaty, or the Washington Treaty system. But if they get it really, really, really fixed into their heads that aircraft carriers must be the way of the future and they must go with them now on the basis of something like Billy Mitchell's tests, then the carrier designs that were being presented in the mid-1920s, generally speaking, were nowhere near as large or as capable as what they get later on. Now, okay, fair enough. Ranger's not exactly all that much to write home about. And they did have a few sketches for things around the size of the Lexingtons, but remember, treaty treaty restrictions with displacement would apply. So if the US had gone on its let's use up our carrier tonnage spree in the mid-1920s, they probably would have built ships smaller than the Yorktowns, probably along the lines of repeat Rangers or some variant thereof, because back at that point, the aircraft would have been small enough, light enough, and slow enough that Rangers, smaller size and slightly lesser capabilities, would have been much less of an issue as compared to what they were by the early 1930s. So you probably would have ended up with a slightly larger, fair enough, US fleet, probably, well, not including Lexington and Saratoga, probably 5 or 6 Ranger type hulls. But then they wouldn't have had any reserve displacement left until the treaty system expires, which is what would eventually lead to the Essexes, except they wouldn't have had the intermediate design stage of the Yorktowns to inform the development of the Essexes, and they would have been going into battles like Coral Sea and Midway with carriers that probably actually even possibly fractionally worse than Ranger, which is not a recipe for a very long lifespan, I'm afraid. So yeah, probably best that they didn't get quite that excited, because the intervening time allowed them to build Ranger, learn from the mistakes made in that, and then allowed them to build the Yorktowns, which were pretty nice ships, and definitely a lot better than I think what they would have come up with in the mid-1920s. Oh boy, it's one of these again. Rafal Chaztek, I think. Alternate history. 3rd of September 1939, in Scapa Flow, both Queen Elizabeth class carriers pop up. Crews missing, no planes, no helicopters, no missiles, etc. How would the Royal Navy react, and how would they use these ships? What impact would they have on the rest of World War II? Let me see. A 60,000-ton carrier suddenly appears in World War II with the size of lifts and hangar space that the Queen Elizabeth has. They'd probably be very confused about the ski jump, to be honest. I'm not necessarily sure they'd use it. They'd probably have to take the ski jump off, or initially, to be honest, they might just take off the right-hand side of the forward part of the flight deck. But, I mean, well, you're talking about ships that are bigger than the Midways and with considerably more deck space. The radar and stuff, it will probably work for as long as it worked. Some of the systems are pretty simple and easy to use because they've got to be military grade, they've got to be not really breakable is the main thing. We're assuming, of course, that all the systems are unlocked because obviously they would be protected by such things. The engines, I don't think they'd have too much of a problem keeping the engines fueled. Maintenance would be the main thing, so it'd be a case of how long can they keep these things running with the basic maintenance that they're able to do, because once electronics start to break, so electronic control parts of the engines and such, then you're going to have more trouble, and they're such large vessels that by the time they do break down, it's not really going to be practical to tear them apart and re-engine them with current era systems, because the war's going to be long over by the time you manage to fix that. And that might have interesting implications post-war, but I think the Royal Navy would probably try and use them as best they could immediately, and they'd have a truly ridiculous air group. In fact, they'd probably run into the same issues that the US Navy ran into with the Essexes and the Midways later on, which is that they'd probably end up putting so many aircraft on they'd figure out, actually, this is too many. Although, with that said, with the sheer size of that deck, and I know it's very implausible, but come on, we're an alternate history where the Queen Elizabeths have popped into Scapa Flow, so. But with the size of that flight deck, they might be able to get a navalised version of Westland Whirlwind. I know it's my pet little hobby horse, but I can dream. The CIWS, actually, assuming it works, would be very interesting for anti-aircraft defence. A couple of phalanxes on there. John Rees asks, World War II question. There's a terrible mix-up where somehow the cooks and food from the French Navy are sent to the Royal Navy and vice versa. The fleets are then rapidly deployed to separate oceans, so there is no hope to rectify the situation anytime soon. which navy mutinies over the food first? The French by a country mile. The Royal Navy, if they're served fancy French food, most of the crew are probably just going to shrug and go, dinner's quite nice today. A little bit weird, but okay. But, I mean, I know British cooking does get slated perhaps a little bit unfairly, although then again, being British myself, I do have something of a taste for it, so maybe I'm biased. But yeah, I can't imagine the French Navy reacting very well to being fed standard Royal Navy food for too long, especially when they're told there's no wine. Actually, that'd be the first thing. The officers, when they're suddenly told there's not actually massive supplies of wine on board, but there's plenty. Well, there's plenty of cheese. They might not worry too much. But yeah, I think the wine shortage will get them first. John asks, what happens if there are no interwar naval arms limitation treaties? Do we see nations bankrupting as we did at the end of the Cold War? Does World War II start sooner or later? Do we see the Great Anglo-American War of 1928? The first one who's going to bow out with bankruptcy is Japan. We're probably going to see, and I think I've covered this a couple of times before, but we're probably going to see you have the N3s, G3s, TOSAs, etc., that generation. You'll probably see the generation after that, so ships being laid down in 1924, 1925. You probably, at least on the British and American side, will see the ships that come after that as well. So 1926, 1927 era ships. But although the Japanese designed the number 13 battleships, if they're trying to compete unlimited, unrestricted with the kind of numbers that the USA and to a lesser extent the British can pump out at that point, the Japanese economy is going to get quite badly hit, and that's going to be just in time for this starting wave of the Great Depression to kick in, which is going to bring the whole thing crashing down and to an end. Now, it's often said that, Britain was bankrupt after World War One, etc., they could never afford it. Kind of. If you actually look at the figures, the economic figures for each year in the 1920s, the British were heavily in debt, this is true, but they were actually running a surplus on their budget. They were paying down the debt that they owed people, and by a fairly substantial amount as well. If you end up in a situation where Britain has to compete, and this is the thing, they didn't want another arms race, but if they have to go into another arms race, if you look at the amount they're paying off of the national debt each year and you say, okay, well, they're going to hold the national debt just basically on interest payments only and not pay it down, they've got enough money to fund it. They're not going to be happy about it, but they can keep up at least with a limited budget, probably 4 battle cruisers, 4 battleships, kind of like they did with the G3s, N3s, whereas as long as Congress holds the purse strings open, and how long you want to hold your breath on that depends on your view of Congress, but the US probably can sustain that spending for longer, but definitely can sustain that spending for longer. But one of the reasons for the Washington Naval Treaty was Congress, like the British government, really didn't want to actually have to pay for this. So I suspect Japan will probably have to bow out 1926-27. The other 2 countries, they're going to be in more problems when the Great Depression hits, that's for certain, and the Great Depression is probably going to curtail the arms race in the end. You'll probably see ships with 18-inch guns, maybe a 1 or 2 with 20-inch guns, but nothing bigger than that, probably pushing up to about Yamato displacements. World War II starting is going to be interesting because a lot of World War II is, at least the classic understanding of Germany invading Poland, etc., is more to do with land-based thoughts than naval-based ones. But I don't think the Kriegsmarine would entertain any ideas about challenging the Royal Navy if the Royal Navy is running around in a scenario where the N3s and the G3s are considered maybe second line units. German shipbuilding would have a very, very long way to catch up with stuff like that. As to whether we'd see the Anglo-American War of 1928, it has been posited and hypothesized and considered to be likely by some very eminent naval historians. It's going to depend on the flashpoint. If there is a major flashpoint around 1926, 1927, there potentially could be a war, because at that point, as we said, Japan's probably going to be on its last legs. And with the Anglo-Japanese alliance, one of the things that the British will probably be trying to hold over the Americans, if your main ally is about to bow out of the naval arms race, if there's a big flashpoint at that point, you are looking at a sort of do or die scenario, because after that, you're on your own. If a big flashpoint like that doesn't occur, or maybe it occurs in 1929, by the time the recession's ongoing, or the Great Depression, that's probably all going to fizzle out, just lots of angry stares. That one I've answered in this week's Drydock. Sui 420 Den, destroyers for bases. What did the British get out of the deal, and how were the ships used? And would you make the deal again if you were Churchill? What did the British get out of the deal? 50 or so Clemson and Wicks class destroyers, somewhat old and battered ones, it must be said. How were the ships used? They were actually turned into the second town class. So there were third town class really. Anyway, there were three major town classes in the Royal Navy in the 20th century. You had the town class cruisers of the First World War. You had the town class cruisers of the interwar period, which is what we're more familiar with, things like HMS Belfast. And then you had the town class, which were these Clemson and Wicks class destroyers that were brought in by the Destroyers for Bases deal. They were mostly used as convoy escorts, because they weren't fast enough or heavily armed enough really to compete on the front rank of modern destroyers, which is why they were in reserve for the US Navy. But they did form a very quick and easy bulking out of convoy escorts, as well as coastal work as well, helping to support motor gunboats and motor torpedo boats and such in the English Channel. Indeed, some of them were actually present in the destroyer attack on Scharnhorst and Gneisenau during the Channel Dash. Would I make the deal again if I was Churchill? Probably, especially given that in hindsight the US didn't actually end up using many of those bases for very long. About the only difference I would make is I would insist on getting the good ones, because the US had several hundred of these things lying around, and most of the ones that Britain got were the oldest and most broken down ones. So I'd try and put some more caveats in to insist that I actually got the ones that worked properly, get them out there as soon as possible. Colin Ware. When was the real end of the battleship era as a ship-to-ship weapon? He says, I would argue that it only really ended with the ability to mount air attacks successfully at night. Until that happened, they were useful in their original role. In his evidence, there's a number of night surface engagements in the Pacific War where aircraft were relegated to the scouting role. As a ship-to-ship weapon, I would argue that in the context of a larger fleet, as opposed to on its own, the battleship era probably only really ended with the end of World War II and the advancements in the interwar period. As the primary strike weapon of the fleet, the battleship was probably overhauled at some point in late 1942, early 1943, once you have the big carrier battles like Midway, and carriers have established themselves as lethal enough to actually deal with surface forces. However, as an element of a fleet, i.e. covered by or supported by carriers, they're certainly still viable ship-to-ship weapons. I mean, you have the whole will you take them or will I when Operation Tango is coming in, so the US Navy was certainly still seeing battleships as viable ship-to-ship platforms at that point. And the Japanese, obviously, sending in Yamato, were definitely thinking along those lines, although to be fair, they didn't have much choice at that point. But if you were to, say, take a 1945 scenario and put a battle between two roughly equal, or maybe not quite as unequal opponents as you had in the Pacific War, then there's probably actually a fair degree of utility to the battleship. They did make fairly nice AA platforms with lots and lots of guns. Now, to be fair, yeah, you can do that with cruisers as well. But a fast battleship force, if you think about what the Japanese were trying to do with Tengo, or even indeed Leyte Gulf and the Battle of Samar, if they'd had a couple more fast capital ships there, and they'd had some carrier escort cover, even if it's just fighters to keep the aerial attacks off of them, then the sheer size, durability and firepower of battleships could force their way through to cause some fairly nasty devastation. And I think it's only when you get the glide bombs, rocket bombs and early missiles that mainly the Germans are showing off towards the end of World War II and then get developed into somewhat more mature weapons immediately after World War II, that's when battleships probably start to phase out as ship-to-ship weapons, because those threats are pretty much insurmountable for a battleship. Whereas before that, with proper carrier cover, they would probably still be able to do damage in a situation where the navies aren't hilariously lopsided. And to be honest, night attacks are something of an odd one, because yes, they are very, very difficult to counter if you don't have your own night engagement protocols with regards to air attack. So yeah, for the majority of the central part of the Second World War, night attacks by aircraft are a major threat to surface vessels. But as you get towards the end of the war and onwards, when you have radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, it becomes less of an issue. I mean, your combat air patrol is not going to really factor in at that point, but once you've got radar-guided proximity-fused AA guns, night attacks are slightly less of an outside context problem than they perhaps were a year or two before. Moongara asks, in the May 29th live stream, you said if Germany had been able to keep Der Flinger at the end of World War I, it would be keeping their ship design knowledge alive. Did they not still have design papers for the ship as a starting point? Or were these confiscated by the Allies? Or was it they would have had to refit the ship over time and it was important to keep their shipbuilding knowledge that way? More of the latter, because if they're allowed to keep something like Der Flinger and a few other ships, it means that they've got to consider modernising it at some point, which would be an interesting thing to see. They've got to consider replacements, because if they're allowed to keep it, then in theory they're allowed to build ships of that kind of displacement to replace it. So they would have to keep up current designs of a ship of that kind of upper 20,000 ton size to replace it in time. They would also be constantly, refitting and modernising it, so that would require naval architects to design those modernisations, oversee the refits, etc. And this is the thing about keeping the knowledge alive. It's not that people forget, but people need jobs, and if you're not allowed any ships above 10,000 tons, and so you have no role for ship designers that can do that, they're going to go off and find other jobs, other careers. And so when you want to resume building, they might still be around, but they're going to be very happy in other jobs, thank you very much. And to be honest, in 15, 20 years' time, a lot of them might be retired, and they won't have trained any apprentices, any replacements, all of which they would be doing if you still had a small design bureau around, at least to consider the modernisation, maintenance and replacement proposals for something the size of a Der Flinger. So yeah, it's about keeping that knowledge rolling and ongoing. I mean, you see the same kind of thing with sort of tank factories and shipyards in various countries these days, where if they don't get an order for 5 to 10 years, then their ability to build that tank or that ship or that aircraft goes away, not because the people themselves are physically gone, but they've just moved on to other things, and you're very unlikely to get them back. Oh dear, right, okay. this one, I suppose, is inevitable. Edward Franklin Woods, sabotaging the Albonia Navy. He says, you are the Admiral of the Navy for the neutral nation of Albonia, glorious nation of mud. Of course. In 1946. You are ordered by the government to construct a fleet of vessels to defend Albonia against foreign aggression in an immediate post-World War II world. However, you are a deep cover agent that's been groomed for this task by Albonia's historic rival. Cost is no concern, but the idea is to build a fleet that looks impressive but will fail horribly when it's put into action. Also, Chieftain says hello, so I also say hello to Chieftain. Right, so this is going to be fun. What would I buy? I would buy all the remaining tribal class destroyers, admittedly not that many of them at that point, but all the remaining tribal class destroyers that the Royal Navy has. I mean, they're trying to get rid of them anyway, so I'd buy all of those. The reason is that they look very big, very impressive. They're sort of over 2,000 tons. They've got lots of nice guns, etc. And they're also hopelessly worn out. So they'll look very impressive sitting in port, but I suspect that with a mud-based economy, trying to sail them out after a couple of years is probably going to result in a hilarious number of engineering mishaps, followed by a lot of very confused, disabled Albonian destroyers wandering around. What else could I get? I'd try and persuade the US to see if I could persuade them to sell me on the I-400 submarines that the Japanese made, because they're, again, hugely impressive looking things and completely and utterly impractical. Cruiser-wise, I would buy some Crown Colony class cruisers and some of the Atlanta class cruisers, any that are still around and their subclasses. And what else we get? I get the Worcester class cruisers, a heavy cruiser design. Oh, and for the heavy cruiser design, I'd try and nab Prince Eugen. Admiral Hipper's too broken, really, but yeah, I'd try and nab Prince Eugen off of the Americans as my heavy cruiser flagship. The reasons for that is, again, Prince Eugen, big, fat, flashy looking, will break down at the drop of a hat because I'm not going to bring the German engineering crews. USS Worcester, absolutely fantastic fire rate, looks incredibly impressive, and the guns will stop working in about 30 seconds. The Crown Colonies, because, again, they look nice, high-sided, fast and impressive, and have basically no reserve weight left in them for any kind of upgrades. And the Atlanta's pretty much the same thing, covered in guns, look fantastic, and will have hilarious stability problems if you put so much as a flashlight on top of the island, on top of the bridge. So completely incapable of upgrading as well. Now carriers and battleships. Carriers, I'll buy the Illustriouses off of the UK because, again, big tough carriers. They've survived the entire war, fantastic. Also can't fit anything modern aboard because of those 14-foot high hangars. Battleships. What battleships would I buy? If I'm trying to make them, the thing is, there's plenty of broken battleships, but if I'm trying to make them look impressive, The problem is North Carolina has mostly overcome her propulsion issues. The South Dakotas are actually legitimately good and powerful, albeit cramped. The Iowas are good. Vanguard's alright. King George V's are alright. Might buy them. Yeah, I might buy the Littorios and not tell anyone about the shell issues. Yeah, that's probably the best way to break Albonia. Buy the Littorios, tell no one about the shell issues, and then construct my global naval mission as a long-range one and watch them run out of fuel halfway across the ocean. RJ Blaine says, at times you mention screw or propeller. What is the difference in terms of naval ships? Not a lot. They're largely alternate terms for the same thing. There are a few minor differences if you want to get really, really technical. But for general consumption purposes, and actually, to be honest, for most detail work, there is no real difference between a screw and a propeller. It's the same, different names for the same thing. Starn, expanding on a previous Drydock topic, apparently from the 2nd of August, assuming the Bayerns and Dereflingers weren't scuttled and went to France and the USA respectively, how might they have been modified by their new owners, and how long do you expect that they'd be retained? The Bayerns, I think, will probably stay in French service for quite a while. They're massively superior to the Courbets and the Britannias. The French don't have the money to complete the Normandies, so I can see the French keeping the 2 Bayerns and ditching some of their older ships to get that right, to get that running. I mean, the best case for the French is they get Sachsen and Württemberg as well, and force the Germans to complete them as part of the reparation. So they have a 4-ship class that would allow them to replace the Britannias completely. So they would then have, actually, if you average everything out, including Sachsen and Württemberg, assuming that the French do some kind of modernisation program in the 1930s, similar to what the British did, they'd have 4 roughly modernised Queen Elizabeth analogues to play with, which would be quite nice to fight alongside things like the Dunkirks and Richelieu. If the US gets the Dereflingers, they will probably refit them entirely with newer machinery to get their speed up a little bit and switch them over to oil firing. That will give them the nice fast heavy element for their scouting force that they end up not getting because the Lexingers get turned into carriers. And given that they were even thinking at that point about modernising the Tennessees, old armoured cruisers, this would probably actually suit them a lot better. So given that no one else would have them, and the US would probably end up putting them into kind of a super cruiser type category if they could get away with it. And at worst, means they probably have to ditch Arkansas. I actually think that if they've been properly modernised, the Dereflingers might actually stand a fair while in US Navy service. The main thing will be it depends on the modernisation. If they just take them in as they are, they'd probably be gone in the Great Depression. If they actually manage to pull a full modernisation on them, I think they'd be fairly handy ships to keep around for a good long while. I mean, certainly you'd probably see a fully modernised Dereflinger and Hindenburg will probably be a lot more useful to the US Navy in World War II than Arkansas was. Graham R., how much worse do you think the Kriegsmarine would have been had the Reichsmarine decided to build 3 coastal defence units instead of the Deutschland class? Let's say they go with a very ugly design with 1 main turret forward and 2 secondary turrets aft. Ooh, yeah, that was an interesting one, basically a monitor. How much worse off would they be? In the short term, they'd be slightly worse off because you wouldn't have the panic and the running around that occurred when you had Admiral Scheer and Graf Spee running around in the early parts of the war. But once you get past that, they might actually be slightly better off, because by not doing that, that means they're going to be saving fuel, and for the Kriegsmarine, especially towards the mid and late part of the war, having fuel reserves was a very, very important thing. It also means that when you get things like the Battle of the Barents Sea, if they don't have something like Lützow to take out as the flagship, they're going to have to take Scharnhorst. And since the Battle of the Barents Sea was such a horrific own goal for the Kriegsmarine when it came to Hitler raging about it. I think having something like the Scharnhorst there would make it a very different battle, and Hitler's very, very unlikely to hit the roof over that kind of battle. However that would go down. Definitely not as badly as it did. Michael Thomas asks, he says, I'm lucky to have been able to spend the night aboard USS Texas a few years ago with my son's Boy Scout troop. Therefore, I'm rather familiar with the Spartan bathroom facilities aboard the ship. I'm curious how head facilities evolved from the Age of Sail to World War II - the modern era, and what characteristics of the ship types or intended uses for the ships influenced the development and innovation of shipboard sanitation. To be honest, it didn't advance an awful lot for a very long time. The ship's heads in the Age of Sail and for a good chunk of the post-Age of Sail era consisted basically of planks over the side, and if you were lucky, enclosed planks over the side. I mean, you've got to remember, like, indoor plumbing, even on land, only really showed up in a big way in the 1860s, 1870s. So you only really see it develop in those terms basically around about the time that ship speed starts picking up, really. There's a certain amount of onboard plumbing and such that's installed relatively quickly into the fleet of various nations around 1870s, 1880s, but it's mostly, it's partly driven by social niceties, but in a large part it's also driven by the fact around about that time ship speeds and sizes generally start to pick up, and all of a sudden the way that the old heads used to be organised is not really viable anymore, because it's one thing to basically be sitting on a shaped plank over the edge of the ship when your ship's gently sailing along at 5 or 6 knots and you're maybe 20 feet above the water, but when you're now 40 feet above the water and the ship's charging along at 18, 20 knots, that's an awful lot of force behind the water coming the other way. Let's just leave it there. His Lordship asks, in recent times in Australia there's been a bit of controversy that Ordinary Seaman Teddy Sheehan was denied a posthumous Victoria Cross for his actions on HMS Armidale in 1942. Can you please consider his actions, compare them with awarded naval VCs and give your view of the case? I actually did that in a dry dock a little while ago, and yeah, I totally, at the time, I totally supported the idea that he should get a VC, and luckily enough, since that question was posted, indeed, yes, the next question says since it was posted, he both was recommended for a belated and posthumous VC, and the Queen approved that. So Teddy Sheehan now is the recipient of a very, very well deserved Victoria Cross. So yes, I would refer you to that previous dry dock answer as to my opinion of his action particularly. And yeah, he then follows on with, have the requirements for the VC got tougher, easier, or stayed the same since the 1850s? It's a bit of a delicate question. I would say that generally speaking, the requirements for the VC have probably gotten fractionally tougher, but that is more a case of other medals being brought in, because one of the things you've got to remember about the Victoria Cross is that it was the first medal, at least as far as I can recall, it was the first medal for reward for bravery or gallantry or valor. Wow, I'm turning into Dr. Spooner. That regular British personnel could win. Medals and grants and titles and such, I think up to that point had been the purview of the officer corps, and if you were a regular person, you might get sort of some thanks or some cash reward or something from your commanding officer, or maybe from the service if you were lucky, or a promotion. That's another favoured way of rewarding them, but there wasn't a sort of systemic, here you are a regular ensign rating private in the army and we're recognising your actions with a medal. And so the early Victoria Crosses, if someone performed some outstanding act of valour on the battlefield, you could get a Victoria Cross. Subsequent to that, you have things like the DSO, eventually the RAF, the DFC, and various other medals as rewards for gallantry. So some of the ones where they've definitely crossed the threshold into this person deserves a medal, literally, would now receive these slightly lower order medals, if you like. But still, to win any kind of medal is still a massive achievement. But then it meant that the VC kind of became something that you'd already gone above and beyond to get a medal for bravery, but you had to go above and beyond to get a VC once those other medals were established. So I'd say the overall requirements at the upper end probably haven't changed, but some of the sort of lower thresholds to get VC have probably gone up somewhat. Stefan M asks, for whatever reason, the Royal Navy does not get involved in the Mediterranean theatre of World War One. How did the naval war between the Austro-Hungarian Navy, perhaps even supported by Goeben and Breslau, and the French Navy go in 1914? If Goeben and Breslau are around, the French probably have to worry somewhat. Once the Italians get involved, even with Goeben and Breslau around, there's more than enough firepower between the French and Italian navies to keep the Austro-Hungarians contained. But if we're talking about purely 1914, the French are moving large numbers of troop convoys across to France as part of the opening stages of World War One. They are obviously protecting them quite heavily with various warships, but if the Austro-Hungarians really wanted to make a mess of that, and they've got Goeben, Breslau is just a half-decent cruiser, but Goeben especially, and there's no Royal Navy presence in the Mediterranean, which, to be honest, let's just say is going to be completely out of the question given how much emphasis the Royal Navy put on the Mediterranean for so long. But if for some magical reason they're not there, a raid by fast cruisers with Goeben in support against some of those French troop convoys could cause some major problems. That would not be fun. But the thing is, at that point, the French would basically be screaming for Royal Navy support one way or the other, and they'd get it because the French comprised the bulk of the land forces in that area. On the Western Front in World War One. Sorry. Timmy Waller, Resolution and 2 County class versus Gneisenau, Admiral Hipper and Prince Eugen in the early 1942 North Atlantic. Depends on the scenario. If it's a straight up, these two forces meet in the middle of the Atlantic for no apparent reason, that's going to be something of a close call. I mean, the counties versus the Hippers, that's something of a more even fight. Because yes, you do get like Berwick versus Hipper, but there were some extenuating circumstances there to do with visibility. But then you have ships like Norfolk and Suffolk or Dorsetshire, which definitely would quite happily take on that fight. So when it comes down to Gneisenau versus Resolution, the main thing there is that the county class, they can't fight Gneisenau on their own. So they're going to have to stick close to Resolution, and Resolution is slow, which would give the Germans the ability, the speed difference would be enough to give the Germans the ability to position themselves to cross the T. So in that circumstance, barring Resolution reaching out and touching Gneisenau with its 15-inch guns, and again, the Germans are going to have a range advantage there. But assuming Resolution could do so, then Resolution, that would be enough to drive them off, but it would be the Germans' fight to lose at that point, I think. Whereas if it's a convoy and Resolution and 2 counties are escorting the convoy, then the Germans are probably just going to turn away, because their speed advantage is somewhat negated by the thing that they've got to attack is over there, behind the Resolution, and Resolution basically just has to stay in front of them and its job is done. Plus, also, if they're on a surface raider mission, we know their standing orders not to fight roughly equal forces. The Senkari asks, I've often heard it said that the Roman navy during the Republic was not surpassed by any other navy until the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. Could you discuss this assessment and if you agree with it? The Roman navy during the Republic definitely was surpassed by other navies before 1571. Probably what they're referring to is sheer numbers, because the Roman navy could get very, very, very big in terms of sheer numbers, but triremes, quadremes, quinqueremes, outside of a few very, very large cases, the average trireme, which, to be fair, if you transposed it into the 1500s, people look and go, oh, it's a small galley. They are not individually very impressive ships outside of the very largest by the time that you get into the medieval period. So yeah, size, by sheer hull numbers, yeah, the Roman navy probably wasn't exceeded until that point, but by capability, yeah, a fair bit before then, I would say. There's a second part of the question. Given the above, how far forward in time do you expect you could bring a full-scale fleet from the Roman Republic and reasonably expect them to win a major fleet engagement? I would say... assuming you're going after the Mediterranean theatre or the Northern European coast, somewhere around the 1100s, 11 to 1200s. Because, yeah, a full Roman Republican fleet would probably quite easily win over a fleet of, say, long ships, that kind of design era vessels, and the smaller, earlier cogs and hulks and stuff like that. But once you get into these, well, depending on how you classify it, I mean, what some people might call the early Middle Ages, what some people might call the late migration era, or whatever. Once you start seeing the classic medieval cog with its forecastle and aftercastle, and you've got men in part plate, and then later on full plate, crossbowmen and longbowmen fighting from there. Those ships are big enough and mean enough, as they would prove in the Mediterranean, to take on galleys that are doing ramming attacks without too many concerns, and they've just got such a massive height vantage point and technological advantage in terms of firepower and melee combat armor that at that point the Roman Navy's not going to really be winning much. Warlord Titan Tiberius asks, I've been doing a lot of reading regarding Halsey recently, and I'm curious how you think the Pacific War would have gone if he'd contracted an illness at the start of the war that sidelined him for good. Say a shingles outbreak turned out to be something worse and permanent. Who would have replaced him, and what in the major battles, and what events would have been impacted? We're about halfway through the Patreon questions, just in case anybody is curious. Actually, no, slightly more than that. Halsey going out of action right at the start of the Pacific War would be a very bad thing, and I know a lot of people say, "Oh, yes, but you're not particularly charitable to him when you talk about him a lot." Yes, this is true, but most of the time people are trying to get me to talk about him in the later war period, when his sort of one-track aggression doesn't do him all that many favours, around the time of Leyte Gulf and thereafter. Before that, though, this incredibly aggressive approach that Halsey takes is actually pretty much exactly what the US Navy needs. There are a number of instances where the US is considering pulling out or pulling back from various attacks and advances, and it's in a lot of ways mainly down to Halsey stepping in and going, no, I'm in command here, you are not going to fall back, I'm going to throw everything I have in my fleet at you in order to support you, to make sure that these landings, this occupation, this offensive continues, and we're just going to keep going. And that's, I say, that was the shot in the arm that the US Navy needed after some of the nastier setbacks of 1942. And outside of maybe Admiral King, who's far, far too senior to take theatre command, there isn't really many US senior officers at that point in the war who are anywhere near as aggressive as Halsey. So, yeah, the US Navy would have been a lot worse off without Halsey in 1942 and 1943. Who could have replaced him? Fletcher and Spruance did a pretty good job. I mean, Halsey obviously did bow out of what would turn out to be Midway, and they did pretty good job there and elsewhere. So they would definitely replace him. How these events would have been impacted, the thing is, a lot of the events probably wouldn't have taken place, because without him driving a lot of the aggression behind the US Navy at that point, the US would have probably pulled back out of several theatres when reverses were experienced. Fair enough, collected themselves, come back with even greater force, but then the path of the Pacific War would have been completely different, and so it's practically impossible to say what those events would have been without a massive sort of long consideration of what's going on. Colonel Cheng asks, alternate history question, World War II. Early phase of the Battle of the Mediterranean goes very poorly for the Italians. Littorio at Taranto capsizes rather than running aground upright, resulting in total loss. Caio Duilio suffers a magazine explosion and is irrevocably lost, shockingly. Following a surface actions, let's say an alternate Cape Spartivento, Vittorio Veneto suffers more serious damage to her propulsion and ends up being part of the force caught at the Battle of Cape Matapan. Thus, Vittorio Veneto, Giulio Cesare, and most of which has come back to help, and most of the non-Italian cruisers sent to the bottom in a night action, removing most of the striking power of the Italian fleet. How does this change the balance of power in the Mediterranean and affect the strategic situation in the Far East? Would the Japanese still attack the colonial holdings of European powers in East and Southeast Asia, knowing the Royal Navy is not as tied down in the Mediterranean? And would they have dared to attack Pearl Harbor with the British still an immediate threat in their western flank? If that series of misfortunes had hit the Italians, they've still got Conte de Cavour and a couple of other of their earlier ships around, so the British would still need to maintain forces there. And the thing is that none of that makes Fliegerkorps 10 or the Regia Aeronautica go away, so air power is still a major problem. Submarines are still a major problem. Italian anti-submarine warfare is actually pretty good, and that's obviously not done usually with battleships. So the Mediterranean theatre is still going to be very dangerous. It will relieve Royal Navy pressure somewhat in that they don't have to worry about having quite as many capital ships in the area, but they're still going to have to keep a number there. And yeah, the Japanese are definitely still going after Pearl Harbor because they need to expand. The US economic sanctions on them were not even slowly, actually relatively quickly killing their economy and their ability to fight. They would have to go. They'd be more concerned about the Royal Navy, certainly, but given that the air threat in the Mediterranean isn't really reduced by these events, the Royal Navy is still having to keep most of its carrier force, most of its modern carrier force in the Mediterranean. They're going to have a few more battleships, battle cruisers available, although to be honest, that does kind of make me nervous, because if the Royal Navy has additional capital ships available and they're willing to use them, which they would be in the Far East, but most of the carrier force is still dealing with the Mediterranean and keeping an eye on the Denmark Strait, that's an opportunity for Force Z on an even larger scale, which is just a terrifying thought if you're the Royal Navy. Obviously they don't know that going in advance, but yeah, that wouldn't have ended very well at all. On the other hand, it would make the situation slightly easier for the US, because remember the US sent North Carolina and Washington at various points to help out the UK in the North Atlantic and Arctic regions, and if the Royal Navy can free up more capital ships from the Mediterranean, then those will take up the slack there, which means the US can deploy more of its own modern ships over to the Pacific, which actually increases the American threat more than the British threat. Losing that element of its navy, though, will mean that the British can be a bit more aggressive in terms of surface raids against Italian convoys and such, which overall might shorten the course of the war in the Mediterranean, which might then free up some Royal Navy units to go east earlier. So you might have a British Pacific Fleet in early 1944, for example. Alan Smith, for some reason, every Great Britain joins the US Civil War alternate history scenario has Great Britain joining the Confederacy. And for a nation that outlawed slavery much earlier and that had been running an anti-slavery patrol, not to mention that William Wilberforce probably rise from his grave, this strikes me as out of character. So what would have happened if Great Britain had joined the US Civil War on the Union side? Would much be different? What ironclads would the Royal Navy be able to put in the way of vessels such as CSS Virginia and CSS Alabama? Assume for the sake of this question that the alternate timeline legal team resolve whatever questions of sovereignty might arise from the US government asking for foreign help to suppress a rebellion. Well, obviously the short answer is the side that won wins even harder. But I suspect you're probably looking for something a little bit more complex than that. So if they joined the Union, the blockade would have been a lot more effective, a lot faster. And actually the Union merchant marine and therefore industry would spin up even quicker, because one of the things you've got to remember about the Union blockade is that an awful lot of it was done by commercial ships that the Union Navy had turned around and said, welcome, you're now in the US Navy. Here's a gun. Go and patrol the coast. That obviously takes a number of modern merchant vessels and fairly large ones out of circulation for the Union merchant marine, and converted merchant ships are not the swiftest, which contributes to some of the Confederate success with blockade runners. Whereas if Great Britain joins and they're prepared to make a relatively sizable commitment, at least on the naval side of things, then that doesn't need to happen. So the Union merchant marine is larger, and therefore can trade even more, bring in even more materials, and Union industry spins up a lot quicker. For the Confederacy, on the other hand, if you've got fast squadrons of Royal Navy frigates cooperating with the Union, then blockade runners are going to have a lot harder time. Similarly with surface raiders, because the Royal Navy, okay, fair enough, it's been 50 years or so, but the Royal Navy spent the whole of the Napoleonic Wars dealing with surface raiders, amongst other things. And that's been a big concern of theirs ever since. So you will see probably a lot more efficient hunting down of things like CSS Alabama. And of course, CSS Alabama, if the British are on the Union side, isn't going to get built. Certainly not for the Confederacy anyway. When it comes to things like CSS Virginia, that's a bit more of a tricky one, because the British at that point aren't in the habit of building monitors and coastal defence ironclads, things like that. They've got a few block ships converted for their own purposes at home, but nothing they'd probably really feel safe about hauling over the Atlantic. They've got big ironclads like Warrior and Black Prince and Minotaur, but they're designed for oceanic work, not close-in coastal work like the majority of the Confederate and Union ironclads were. So I don't think that particular thing would happen, but it would allow the Union to concentrate more resources closer in. What they might do is break out any of the massive fleet of gunboats that they'd built for the Crimean War, the ones that haven't rotted away at least, and bring those in and kind of try swarm attacks, given that if they're using things like a 68 pounder with steel shot at full charge at the kind of ranges that Monitor and Virginia were fighting, certainly the 68 pounder will probably have a decent chance of poking holes in something like Virginia. So you might see a lot of those kind of gunboat actions, but yeah, it's overall it's Union wins faster, but the riverine and coastal warfare will be more a case of the Union can focus more resources on that whilst the Royal Navy mops up the oceanic side. Koos Army 0001. What do you personally prefer to do with a drunken sailor early in the morning? Let him sleep until he's sober. Because, yeah. I trying to wake up a drunken sailor early in the morning. I could go and poke a badger with a sharp stick. I could pour myself in honey and try and throw myself into a honey badger den. I could cover myself in raw chicken and step into a coop full of Stella's sea eagles. All of these things would probably be less painful. So yeah, I would quite happily leave them where they are. Plus, it's also highly amusing where in some of the situations they end up in. Does this align with what Admiral Drac would do? Well, of course not, because Admiral Drac would actually have the authority to issue some punishments. Although, to be honest, Admiral Drac would probably go with a kind of slightly more psychological punishment of getting some of their friends to bring them back on board and then giving them license to arrange said drunken sailor in the most embarrassing position possible. Such as, I don't know, waking up in your underwear on top of B turret in the middle of a storm, having presumably tied them down so you don't lose them. That would be the kind of thing that Admiral Drac would do in order to get people to not do that again when they're on their way back from leave. Dominic von Bismarck. How would the war in the Atlantic have differed had Germany foregone Bismarck and Tirpitz entirely, along with other large service units, and focused instead on submariners and submarine technology? Could this have actually made a real impact? Possibly. If they'd gone full out with putting all the men, all the resources, all the steelwork into lots and lots and lots and lots of U-boats, the sheer numbers would have made a massive difference, especially at the beginning of World War II when the Royal Navy's short on escorts, one with the fall of France, short on allies, and and obviously still in the process of developing tactics and technology. If they'd foregone all large surface units, that might have been a bit more of a mistake, because if they've foregone all large surface units, i.e. they're maybe restricted to the Königsbergs and destroyers, I can't see the Germans willing to risk something like the Norway campaign. It would be far, far too easy for that to get utterly annihilated. And I suppose the other thing is, if they've got no large surface units, so no heavy cruisers, no Panzerschiff, no Scharnhorst, no Bismarcks, that means the entire Royal Navy capital ship strength is basically going to come steaming into the Mediterranean, which is going to make the Italians have a very bad day. You probably still want at least something to keep the Royal Navy interested. Miles McCaskill asks, during the late interwar period, an eccentric group of British admirals come up with a new ship concept, a purpose-built ramming ship. They argue a large, fast cruiser can be modified to create a ship capable of absorbing capital ship-grade gunfire whilst possessing the speed and manoeuvrability to threaten enemy capital ships with ramming. Take off primary, secondary armament, barbettes, magazines, torpedoes, anti-aircraft guns, etc., etc., as well as the crew needed to operate them. So basically, we have a Korean turtle ship minus the masts and sails, lots of periscopes and little radar installations. High speed in the high 30s of knots. Massive ram bow, basically a turtle back of steel. Briefly describe the ship that would be produced given these parameters, and then using a quantum butterfly-proof Drydock magic, put the ship alongside Hood and Prince of Wales at the Battle of the Denmark Strait. Does it have a meaningful role to play? Oh boy. If somebody was mad enough to try and build something like that, I suspect it would end up looking something akin to those slightly odd French torpedo rams, which I posted a picture of a while ago. They're very strange. They basically look like upturned hulls that someone's built a tiny bridge on. But if you're building something heavy cruiser size, a 10,000 ton turtleback ram, you could probably fit, to be fair, at that point you probably could fit enough armour on there to deflect capital ship gunfire, and it's going to be an absolutely tiny target, low profile. As for its effect at the Battle of Denmark Strait, if the thing's capable of the high 30s of knots, it's probably going to come charging over the horizon several minutes before Hood and Prince of Wales. Assuming that Bismarck notices it, it's going to be rather worrying, because basically a 10,000-ton slab of pointy steel heading towards you is basically the world's biggest self-guiding torpedo, which is probably going to be something of a distraction, which means Hood probably at least doesn't receive the shot that kills it, because Bismarck's going to be shooting at this thing. Whether or not it connects with Bismarck, that's another thing entirely, because of course gun penetration goes up massively when you get very close, and Prince Eugen can launch torpedoes, so I don't necessarily think it's going to succeed in that ramming mission, simply because of the threat it presents, but it might distract Bismarck long enough for Hood and then later Prince of Wales to start getting guns on there. So Long John. Free-for-all between a New Orleans, Admiral Hipper, Kirov, and a County-class heavy cruiser. Who is the last one standing? Oh, that's an interesting one. It's going to depend on the era. If you're talking interwar and coming up into the early part of World War II, I would say it's a coin toss between the Hipper and the County. If you're talking mid-war, it's probably a three-way tie between the New Orleans, the Hipper, and the County, and by the late war it's probably the New Orleans with the County in a close second, followed by the Hipper. The Kirov, no. Next question is, how did Scharnhorst and Gneisenau get the nicknames Salmon and Gluckstein? I believe that was an RAF term for them, based off of a cigarette maker, I believe. It was yes, it was because on the cigarettes they were manufactured by I think a maker called Salmon and Gluckstein, which in and of itself is just, I'm sure there's a bizarre story behind that, but I think it was the logo on the front was S&G, and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are S&G, and as any German speaker who's been listening to this will probably say, my ability to pronounce Gneisenau, whatever the heck it's called properly, is pretty much non-existent. So Scharnhorst is slightly easier, but it was probably just a lot easier for various people to go, oh, we will call it this thing we can more easily pronounce. Classe Cornate asks, when the US, in a hypothetical non-Washington Treaty scenario, realizes that with the G3s, the Lexington's a glorified courageous class, would they build a Tillman 3 in response? Probably not, because the Tillman 3 is slow. They will probably either massively modify the Lexingtons, or start a whole new design process. It's actually something I discussed relatively recently with a couple of people on the Discord, and I advanced the position that they would, assuming that you're going forward with a non-Washington Treaty selection, the US would probably, once they hear about the G3s and the Amagis, I think they probably actually complete Lexington and Saratoga as carriers anyway, because they're fairly well down the construction path, and turning them into carriers is probably the least worst option, and they would then use that time in order to develop significant modifications to the Lexington class design and finish the next 4 Lexingtons in a somewhat beefed up manner, maybe sacrificing a few knots of speed in exchange for armour that might actually have some effect. Jonathan Smith, alternate history. The Battle of Coronel was fought at fairly close range, 12,000 yards or less. If an early Fletcher from 1942 somehow found its way back in time to assist Craddock, how well could it have done in a gun duel against von Spee's squadron? Since it's 10 knots faster, the 5-inch guns can reach out that far or further and should have far better fire control. It's also night, so if the Fletcher has its radar-directed fire control, that's going to be a very, very interesting scenario. The 5-inch guns, to be honest, I mean, they could get close to the two Scharnhorsts and start messing up their upper works. That's true. However, weirdly enough, between rate of fire, accuracy, and simply having a 5-inch gun, you could make an argument that the Fletcher's actually much better armed in a gunfight than the German light cruisers like Dresden and Nuremberg that are present. So, if I was a Fletcher captain, I would probably try and get as close as possible, probably using Monmouth and Good Hope as cover, burst out in front of them, volley off 5 of my torpedoes, i.e. one launcher, at one of the German armoured cruisers, the other 5 at the other, and then charge off into the darkness and happily go play with the German light cruisers, which I'm almost certain to, at least if I take them on one-on-one, probably certain to beat in a night action. And yeah, with a spread of torpedoes from a range far beyond what they're expecting from a ship that they can't really easily identify, there's a relatively good chance that one or more of the Scharnhorst will eat at least one torpedo, which is going to be something of a distraction. And then once I've finished off or crippled the light cruisers, then I can try and stalk the Scharnhorsts as night falls completely, and I get more and more advantage on my radar. Rich Feeler, I don't know. It's like Fiesler, but without the S. With the US and other navies using nuclear power, how is this going to affect the ability to take a significant capital ship and turn it into a museum? I did kind of cover that in the page on Drydock more generally, but in that, actually, a number of people pointed out that, including actually the Chieftain, pointed out that the Savannah was a nuclear-powered vessel and was used as a museum ship, albeit they had to keep some watch over it, and there are one or two others. But yeah, there's this kind of thing of where you've got them. I'm guessing the more military-grade reactors, they're still closed off, and you can't go and see them, and it takes a fair bit to keep them maintained. The Savannah, apparently, you could go and see its reactor, so I'm again assuming, because this is a little bit outside my area of expertise, that its reactor wasn't as sensitive for whatever reason. But pretty much, as I said in that Drydock, and modified by these other things that people have followed up on, you're going to end up in a situation where you can't keep the reactor there unless you're supposed to go through the expense of monitoring it and also closing off a significant volume of the ship to people's access. So that's an expense. The other option, of course, is to take the reactor out, which is also a fairly big expense, but probably the better thing to do in the long run. If you really want to, you can probably put a mock-up of the reactor that removes all the sensitive indicators, and otherwise you just get a nice big space to put something else in. He also asked, can you cover the placement of and history of elevators on aircraft carriers? Yes, but that would have to be in a Wednesday video on carrier design. There's no way I can do that justice in a few minutes. Michael A. Kalane, warships are nice, but it's logistics that win wars. Can you cover the Liberty and Victory ships during World War II? I will do in a Wednesday video at some point, yes. Again, this is one of the things that I had planned for the channel this year that was put on hold by the pandemic, because I was planning on visiting the Red Oak Victory in, is it San Francisco or Los Angeles? One of the two. Anyway, that side of the world. And doing some filming on that and using that as the basis of a Wednesday special on the Liberty and Victory ships, and of course wasn't able to do that. Hopefully next year I'll be able to do that. Chipster8253 asks, for some reason beyond the normal ken of men, the Kriegsmarine decides that instead of building the Deutschland class and arming the Scharnhorst with 11-inch guns, and also not building the Bismarcks, instead they use all of these materials to field an additional 6 Scharnhorst hulls, as well as lengthening the Hippers. The Hippers are then armed with the 11-inch guns from the Scharnhorst of the Deutschlands. Okay, that'll be interesting. So you've got 8 Scharnhorst with the 6 15-inch guns available by 1939. What effect does that have on the Battle of the Atlantic and the overall outcome of the first half of the war? I don't think putting the 11-inch guns from the Scharnhorst or Deutschlands on the Hippers is going to work. I mean, replacing a twin 8-inch with a triple 11, especially the triple 11s from the Scharnhorsts. Yeah, that's. I don't think you can actually get those on a Hipper hull and still have anything approaching a reasonable warship. I'd be interested to see if you could even physically get the barbette ring on something like a Hipper hull. But that aside, you'd also have to start early with the Scharnhorsts because there's only a limited number of slipways that can take Scharnhorst size hull. So, I mean, getting 5 Scharnhorsts in the water by World War II is probably realistic if you don't build the Bismarcks, and if you expedite things a bit, then maybe getting another 2 or 3 built by 41 is possible. But you'd have to have started the Scharnhorst early and know that this was your big plan to get 8. I mean, if you started maybe a year and a half earlier, you could get 3 and then another 3, and then that would give you 6, and then you'd be maybe building another 3, but those wouldn't quite be ready for the start of World War II, but almost. You'd also have to be building them without armament for a while, because getting the 15-inch gun ready would take some time. So yeah, but let's assume for the minute that you actually do get these 8 Scharnhorst round. It's going to lead to a big naval confrontation very quickly, because the Royal Navy can't have that many heavily armed ships floating around for very long. They'll either try and press for some kind of Taranto style attack on the German ports. The Lions definitely are going to get built. In fact, it might actually even be early enough for the French to get involved with Dunkirk and Strasbourg. I can see a very, very big naval battle developing pretty early on, because with 8 ships like that, the Kriegsmarine probably will feel confident enough to actually challenge the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy will want that fight to happen as soon as humanly possible, before even more German ships show up from their magical Scharnhorst production line. Bale Iniora, are there any other examples similar to the Battle of Pylos in more modern times where a fleet defeats an army? There's plenty of examples where shore bombardment has helped defeat an army, and where a fleet has escorted an army into land to defeat an army. But in terms of direct combat, where the fleet physically shoots the army up and the army tries to shoot back, can't think off the top of my head of any. About the closest you could come to a technical one of that would be the Battle of the Nile, but that's Nelson defeating the enemy fleet, which in turn defeats Napoleon's army because he's cut off all his supply. Yeah, because the thing is, by the time you get big explosive shells, most armies know to keep well away from a fleet, and the fleet can't follow them. Outside of weird river campaigns, but that's not really an Oceanic Navy style thing. Timothy Sims, if all 4 of the Admiral-class battlecruisers had been completed, would the US Navy and Japanese Navy be allowed to build the Lexington and Amagi-class battlecruisers under the terms of the Washington Treaty? I mean, the British managed to get Hood in there somehow without any reciprocals. Probably largely on the basis of the fact that whilst its armour and weaponry were roughly equivalent to Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Elizabeth wasn't the latest and greatest being built at that point. I don't think well, you definitely wouldn't have got all 6 Lexingtons, because 6 Lexingtons versus 4 Admirals is a massive disparity of capability. The Amagis actually are almost just as bad, because 10 16-inch guns versus 8 15-inch and similar armour and speed. No, I think there would have had to have been some allowances, definitely, but I don't think, and I don't think anyone would have seen that as equal at all. I'm trying to think what kind of about the only real compromises I can think of is that because the Admiral class, assuming that their construction had continued, would be probably still be at the fitting out stage. They'd probably maybe expand that to convert at least 2 of them into carriers or something like that. Charles Fitt, are you familiar with the alternate history story? The whale has wings, and if so, what do you think? I'm not, but I will have a look. Remind me if you are watching this, Charles Fitt, please remind me in this month's Patreon question stream, but also remember to ask a second question, because I will read it and so I will answer both questions next time. Stafford Magnus, were blowout panels ever considered for the rear of main gun turrets to prevent catastrophic explosions in the case of them being penetrated, carried over from July? I believe I answered that. I'm pretty sure I answered that. In fact, I'm very sure I answered that. So yes, see my previous answer to that, albeit I would add that there were some hatches and panels on the backs of turrets to help vent smaller explosions, but still, as I said in my original answer, they wouldn't have been enough to safely vent a full-on catastrophic explosion of all the ammo there, but it would have been enough to somewhat lessen the impact of maybe the odd charge going off. I will check on that, but I'm 99.9% sure I answered that. Which of course means that since this was your question for this month, you get 2 questions next month. Yes, Daniel's Politics 1 says I answered that extensively and in great detail, apparently. Coltax 100, are you answering chat questions or still Patreon? It's still just about on Patreon. We're very near the end, actually. Timo Fiebig asks, we know Admiral Tegethoff due to the Battle of Lissa video, but could you talk about his other naval action, the Battle of Heligoland in 1864? Yes, again, this will be a Wednesday video. It's on my long list of Wednesday videos to produce. Now, please bear in mind, everybody, that doesn't mean I'm not saying don't ask me. What I'm saying is that when you mention something like this, if it's a naval battle or a famous ship or a famous person, I will very, very happily cover it, no problem, as long as you ask for it. Just be prepared for the fact that it will go on a very long list. So it will be covered eventually. It's the wonderful thing about naval history. There's so much of it, you're not getting rid of me anytime soon. Jeffrey Cook asks, what are some battleship engagements that nearly occurred but didn't for whatever reason? Like Scharnhorst and Eisenhower almost fighting HMS Ramillies in February 1941. Oh, battleship engagements that nearly occurred but didn't for whatever reason. Well, the obvious one is if Halsey left behind his vast battleships to face off against Kurita at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That's a nice one. There's the, actually still saying that area of the world, there's the will you take them or will I for Operation Tango, if the coins would come down the other way and the battleships had been sent off instead of the carrier aircraft. What else do you have? I don't know if it technically counts as a battleship, but if Graf Spee had tried to hang it out longer in Montevideo, then eventually Renown would have actually got there. So I guess you could have seen Graf Spee versus Renown for all the one-sidedness that would have been. Let's see. There's obviously the High Seas Fleet and the 1st Scouting Group versus Admiral Warrender and Beatty in World War I. That almost happened but didn't. You've got the German advance, as I mentioned earlier, where Moltke lost its screw, that almost, a big full-on confrontation that almost happened, but didn't. You've got the two Invincibles versus Goeben and Breslau, which didn't happen purely because declaration of war took a few hours longer. So if war had been declared all at the same time, then that certainly would have been a confrontation that kicked off. Let me think. What else have we got? There's the Austro-Hungarian attempt to break the Otranto barrage. If they hadn't, actually, weirdly enough, if the Italians hadn't gone after Svent Istvan quite as effectively, that might have ended up in a proper gunfight. Yeah, there's quite a few. I could probably go on like that, but I'm spending a lot of time there. Cipher, alt history. That's the Albanian Navy question again. So I've answered that one. Mason, what could the Italians have done to make the Battle of Cape Spartivento a victory rather than the abortive effort it was? Find whoever was in charge of shell control for the Italian Navy and shoot them. That pretty much answers many questions about how to improve your Italian naval performance in World War II. Get shells that don't have the dispersion of a movie shotgun, and suddenly all those wonderful rangefinders and those insane numbers of rangefinders they stick on practically everything will actually have a very good effect. Because this is the thing, you've got to remember, with an awful lot of these battles that the Italians fought with the Royal Navy, the Italians were firing at very long ranges and they were getting straddles very quickly. It was incredibly impressive, a performance from the Italian optical fire control systems. Their big problem was that they were straddles, and they were straddles with sometimes a scatter radius of over 1 kilometre, which meant they weren't going to hit anything except by pure luck, which must have been incredibly frustrating for them. And then, of course, the one or two times they actually seem to have got a decent batch of good quality shells, they end up, at those points, ending up with a slightly less accurate gunnery for some bizarre reason. Mohammed Alabi asks, I heard from somewhere that the Revenge class battleships regularly outperform the Queen Elizabeths in their gunnery trials. Is this true, and if so, why? I don't necessarily think so. There's no particular reason for them to have done so. They've got roughly similar fire control equipment most of the time, and the Queen Elizabeths have more modern fire control equipment, certainly post their 1930s modernizations. You'd have to say when. You'd have to say when, because if someone said, oh, the Revengers were much better than Queen Elizabeth's in gunnery in the 1930s, I'd say flat out, no, that's not happening. In the 1920s, that I could believe, because the Revengers got partial refits and upgrades to a slightly higher standard than the Queen Elizabeths at that point. The Queen Elizabeth's getting some rebuild, but not obviously the full modernisation they'd get later on. So during that era, yes, I can believe it, and possibly during the latter part of World War One, once the Revengers are in service, because they're brand new ships and have less wartime wear and tear on them. But outside of those specific circumstances, I can't see any particular reason why the Revenge class would be regularly better than the Queen Elizabeth's. And then the last Patreon question, Ben, do you think that if Yamato had made it to shore in Operation Tango, it would have actually been of some use? Purely hypothetical. Let's say the Americans were snoozing and it made it there unscathed. It would certainly cause an awful lot of damage for the few hours it would actually stay in a recognisable shape. But yeah, it would cause an awful lot of damage right up until the point that the skies darkened with aircraft and the regular queue of battleships shows up offshore to basically compact the Yamato into a small metal cube with a lot of dents on the side. So yeah, very casualty causing, possibly stalls the invasion, but it's not going to stop it. Because there's too much wrapped up and too much firepower present to get rid of it too quickly. So that is that. And let's get on with questions from here, from the chat. So Matey83 was first in there with alternate history. 3 design Z cruisers, i.e. HMS Minotaur, i.e. the tier 10 cruiser from World of Warships for the British, if you're familiar with those. Get built between 1951 and 54. How would they fare in combat? Would the Navy have kept them past the Falklands, and would the twin Oerlikons be exchanged for single Bofors? I think the Navy definitely would have kept them around. I mean, they've got multiple radar guided heavy anti-aircraft guns, plus the rapid-fire 6-inch weapons, which eventually would find their way in much smaller numbers onto Tiger. And given that Tiger and Blake stayed around almost to the Falklands War, and being much smaller ships with less firepower in the first place, had much less utility, full-on 3 HMS Minotaurs. They've got so much more utility for upgrades. They've got so much more capacity for modernisation, and even with that, their gun-based anti-aircraft firepower is still quite massively useful. So yeah, they probably would still be around at the Falklands, and yeah, they probably would initially have Bofors, and then probably the Bofors would eventually go, and they'd just be left with their heavy AA side armament. Right, so let me catch up with a few of the super chat questions that have popped up, and then we'll go on with the general questions. Just Jeff, what was the method of pulling the trigger on main battery guns? Was this controlled piece by piece or centrally from fire control? That actually varied. You could fire the guns individually or centrally, all from fire control. You could also fire them individually or all at once from the turret itself. And by the time of World War II, most of the time this is done by a button. I was actually on HMS Belfast earlier this week, and yeah, when you're in the turret, you can actually see there's little push buttons, a bit like an old school melamine plastic and iron doorbell, that kind of thing. It's just like press, boom, and those controls are replicated in other areas of the ship, such as the fire control section, with obviously notification systems in order to make sure that people are not, say, standing behind the gun when it goes off. Older systems, of course, did exist where you might actually physically pull a lanyard, which would be fun, especially when you're talking about battleship grade guns. But yes, remote firing very, very quickly became a thing once guns started to get very large. Muriel Cunningham, will you do a video on the U505? Yeah, sure. When? Don't know. But on the list it shall go. 9 pool days. Thank you very much. He just wanted to say hello and thank you and give some support. So that's very nice of him. Animal 16365. This question may be out of your normal time frame, but how does a modernised Essex class and the Clemenceau class carriers, I'm guessing that means compare? The Clemenceaus. Well, the Clemenceaus are newer, so they're going to be designed with more modern systems. And it's probably a slightly, I say a slightly more durable flight deck, but if we're talking about fully modernised Essex, they would have had the chances to rebuild that. Overall, I would give a slight advantage to the Clemenceaus purely because they would have been built with more modern aircraft in mind, and they're going to be physically newer ships. So they're going to have, by the time you're in a position to compare the Clemenceaus in service with the modernised Essex, unless you've been very, very, very carefully husbanding it, like let's say you completely rebuild Franklin or Bunker Hill, which have basically been sitting in reserve since World War II. But outside of that, all the other Essexes are going to have a lot of miles on the clock, and by the time the Clemenceaus are in service. So those kind of basic quality of life issues are going to give the Clemenceaus an advantage beyond anything else. But outside of that, if you're looking for something to operate a bunch of A4s off of, if you're looking at kind of that kind of scenario, then probably actually the Essexes will do relatively well, assuming that it is fully modernised. They'd certainly be in the same ballpark at least as Clemenceau and Foch, assuming absolute full modernisation. But I say that if I was forced to choose between the two purely on capability terms, the Clemenceaus are probably just about going to edge that. Sir Liv, since you mentioned a secondary interest in railways, could you tell us a bit about the Jellicoe specials? I could. Not off the top of my head, though, unfortunately. I know what you're talking about, but whilst I have an interest in railways, I can't pull that kind of information just straight off the top of my head the way I can with most of the naval stuff. But if I had some notepaper, I would. But okay, if you're still listening, Sir Liv, drop me an email reminding me, and then not in this Sunday's Drydock, but in the next Sunday's Drydock, I will include a little extra question to talk a little bit about the Jellicoe specials. How on earth do you pronounce that? Duke Coupe? Hopefully you know roughly what I'm talking about. What ship should the Royal Navy have built that never made it past the paper stage? Would have been excellent, but there was a shortage of money. Lion-class battleships. Lion-class battleships, definitely. What else could they have built that never made it past the paper stage and would have been excellent? Well, as we covered, the Minotaurs, expensive as they would have been and probably somewhat problematic as their 6-inch guns might have been, would have provided a superb basis for a nice set of large flagship style units for the Royal Navy going through the Cold War. Other paper ships, the Malta class carriers similarly. I mean, you look at the amount of service that the Royal Navy got out of Ark Royal and Eagle, the Audacious class. If they'd managed to get the final design proposal for the Malta done just through sheer size, it would have been a lot more adaptable going forward. Whether or not that would have allowed the Royal Navy to stave off the cuts that tried to get rid of carrier aviation is another matter, but one can hope. Other ships the Royal Navy could have built and never made... yes. Fisher's Proto-Lions, which he wanted to build instead of the Indefatigables. If those had been built instead of the Indefatigables, I think a lot more Royal Navy sailors would have lived through Jutland, both through sheer firepower and also actually having meaningful armour protection. Ray W, what's your favourite battleship of World War II? Do you really have to ask that question? Of course it's going to be Warspite. Yeah, of course it's going to be Warspite. Warspite looks good, fights hard, survives ridiculous amounts of damage. And for Warspite, it's its second round. So, yeah, of course that's going to be my favourite battleship there. V8 Muffler Boy, please share this with the museum of your choice. I will. In fact, given what I mentioned on the World of Warships live stream and in the Drydock last week, I will share that with the Battleship New Jersey Museum. Victory for Cake. Do you think that Babylon 5 deserves an HD remake with a remade CGI? It was on film, so it was meant to be possible. Also, how big was your beard at its biggest? Yes, Babylon 5 definitely deserves an HD remake with remade CGI. I do remember from the last kind of special for Babylon 5 they made a little while ago, it was quite amusing because they were talking about the fact that they were using the full film 3D models from the original show as the placeholder effectively coloured in wireframes for modern 3D CGI tech, and that was several years ago. So it's one of those things where it's almost criminally easy to make Babylon 5 fan videos, because the CGI, the graphics and polygons and everything are so basic. You can make stuff that looks like it's straight out of the show. In fact, you can make stuff that looks a bit considerably better than what was in the original show with a basic computer. So it shouldn't be too expensive, to be perfectly honest. I mean, if they've still got the paths and the tracing settings and everything, to be honest, I think there's probably enough of a fan community. They do the CGI themselves just for the love of it. If the IP holders ever got round to thinking properly. The actual show itself, I mean, it is a 90s TV show, so putting it into full HD might not do it too many favours. I mean, like the Star Trek Next Generation remake in HD, the space stuff looks great, but some of the interior shots in full HD, you can tell just how 90s TV props were. Perhaps give it a little bit of a workover as well with the CGI to help increase the detail levels. But yes. Also, how big was your beard at its biggest? It's a good question. Got a few photos somewhere. Probably about 3 times this thick. No, not quite as thick as my hair is at the moment. Yeah, that was years ago. Maybe I'll grow it out at some point again. I don't know. I'm never going to be able to compete with Jingles, to be honest. So that's not going to happen. What is your favourite looking ship? Drac, Commander Wolfman asks. Ooh. Oh, that's a good one. Favourite looking would either be a theoretical refitted HMS Hood - HMS Renown, or the modernised New Mexico class battleships. I do have a soft spot for the New Mexico class. I don't know what it is about them precisely. I think I've said before that the bow shape especially is quite nice, but along the standard class development line, someone somewhere hit a really nice aesthetic with the New Mexicos that somehow the follow-on classes didn't quite work quite to that degree. And I can never figure that one out, to be honest. But I just look at the New Mexicos in their original form, although I hate the cage masts, but especially in their modernised form, I just go, for a solid, blocky, punchy battleship, that's almost the perfect aesthetic. Jonathan Smith, I'd really have liked to know what the battle would have been like if Admiral Halsey had detached his surface action elements to block the straits. Very violent. Very, very violent, because you would have actually got everybody was asked, Iowa versus Yamato. Or an Iowa, at least, versus Yamato. Oh, that would have been glorious to see. Yeah, it would have... Because the thing is, because it's a daylight battle, okay, yes, there's patches of fog and such like which mess with some of the Japanese optical systems, but it's a daylight battle, so the Japanese aren't going to be completely overawed by radar-assisted fire control, and like or not, those 18.1-inch shells are going to hurt things that they hit. I can't foresee Kongo and Haruna lasting all that long, to be honest. I mean, okay, Hiroshima did have the disadvantage of being at point-blank range to Washington, but even at longer ranges, they're not really going to be able to withstand too many hits from the kind of force that Halsey had proposed sending to block off the area. So it's basically going to be a very rapidly outnumbered Nagato and Yamato trying to put down as much damage as possible before they get sent under, with various torpedo attacks and such like, I'm sure, getting involved. But it would have been a glorious fight for both sides, although the US is going to win that one. Wolfie916, hey Drag, do you have any plans to visit Scotland and maybe do videos on Scapa Flow - the John Brown and Company or the fourth coastal batteries? I've been to Scotland a few times actually. I do quite like it. So yes, I do have plans to visit Scotland again, as long as they don't, as long as well, actually, independence or not, I don't actually. That wouldn't affect my travel plans too much, just as long as there aren't border patrols who are stringing up Englishmen at the first sign of assault here. But no, seriously, I actually do genuinely like Scotland. It's a very nice place. As far as videos on Scapa Flow, that would require me getting to the Orkneys, which in the current situation is not going to happen. Although I have actually talked with a couple of people based there about going there once access reopens. So yes, Scapa Flow video definitely happening in the future once travel reopens. Well, to be honest, I'm not going to do it in the winter because winter down here in London is bad enough. Winter in the Orkneys, the plane will probably be landing sideways. So yeah, wait until the weather's slightly better and it's slightly lighter. For the coastal batteries, as well, yeah, coastal fortifications in general, definitely I can go and have a look around. Again, once I'm able to do so safely. Stuff happens. Spartani 548, what happened to HMS Furious's 18-inch guns? They got stuck on a couple of monitors, and then the monitors got their own light railway system to move the shells around. Lord Clive class monitors. I've actually done a video on them where you can see the plan for the little miniature railway on a ship. Very cute things. Slightly questionable placement of the gun, but never mind. Matey 83, that's the one already answered there. UNSC forward on to Dawn. Hello Drac, hope you're well. Yes, I am, thank you, I think. Suppose after Coronel, Princess Royal is sent to the South Atlantic instead of the Invincibles. How does Falklands battle then go? Does it win easily or does she run out of ammo first? Princess Royal had a pretty good reputation for gunnery, and to be honest, a 13.5-inch shell is going to do a heck of a lot more damage than a 12-inch shell. In fact, 1914 and Princess Royal Gunnery is probably actually going to be able to use CPC shells. And for those of you who aren't aware, I've talked about them briefly before, but in the era of distributed armour, very briefly in the 1900s and early 1910s, the British had this idea that HE shells would burst on the distributed armour scheme, so that HE shells perhaps weren't so useful, but they noticed that with the massively increasing armour penetration capabilities of the big guns, that actually for the distributed armour and for the armour of more lightly built ships like armoured cruisers and such, the 12-inch, 13.5-inch AP was actually massive overkill. You might get over penetrations, and so they developed this CPC shell that's kind of a halfway hybrid. It's called Common Point Capped, hence CPC. It's this weird hybrid between HE and AP. So it's got some of the armour piercing properties of an AP shell, but not quite as much. But it has a massively bigger bursting charge, close to that of an HE shell. And yeah, if Princess Royal is down there in 1914, it's probably still carrying some CPC, or certainly could have been loaded up with some very easily. That is going to be absolutely awful for von Spee, because you're effectively going to get probably at least 100 pounds of explosive detonating inside your ship when the CPC shell punches through your armour. That's going to be the end of the Scharnhorst very fast. And also, being physically faster in the first place, Princess Royal will catch them sooner. Yeah, CPC shells were an absolutely horrific weapon, but had a very, very niche use, and therefore kind of died out relatively quickly. Archangel Glenn, assuming the skill of the crews was equal, who would win in a battle between Bismarck, South Dakota, and King George V? Probably South Dakota. Because by the time that all three, well, to be honest, actually, by the time all three are contemporary and can fight, although Bismarck would have to be probably Tirpitz, South Dakota and King George V will have a slight technological edge in terms of radar and fire control. Although the Germans would still have it, it's just not quite as advanced. There may still be the issue with Bismarck knocking out its own forward radar by firing, or turrets, I guess. It depends if they fix that issue. At which point, South Dakota and King George V are more likely to get hits in sooner. And South Dakota's got 16-inch shells. So if it's going to get more hits in sooner and it's got the biggest shells, that's probably gonna win it the fight. And this isn't about sinking, but rendering mission ineffective. I think a South Dakota versus Bismarck, the South Dakota will render Bismarck combat ineffective pretty quickly. South Dakota versus King George V, you're probably looking at similar rates of hitting. King George V is marginally better protected. South in absolute terms, but South Dakota again has the heavier guns, so an individual hit from South Dakota is going to do somewhat more damage, which means that King George V is more likely to become combat ineffective sooner. So yeah, South Dakota's probably going to edge that one. Last writes, Zero, I need intelligence data. I'm sure you do. Oh dear, that's a good game. Zeraxis, if the IJN and Imperial Japanese Navy and Kriegsmarine work together to design a ship, what would it look like? Oh boy. And what sorts of improvements do you think could or would be made in contrast to the issues that commonly arose in both navies? If they're working together to design a ship, depends what kind. Because a hybrid Japanese-German common design battleship, carrier, cruiser, heavy cruiser, light cruiser, destroyer, submarine, they're all going to look very, very different. Broadly, in terms of themes, the Kriegsmarine is probably going to rein the Japanese temptation for building their ships overly light. But at the same time, they're also probably going to just open up the Japanese up to the idea of you don't have to build your ships to something that you can just about get away with lying about when it comes to their displacement. You just flat out ignore the weight limits. Look at what we've done with the Prince Eugen. Yeah. Although the idea of giving U-boats Type 95 long lance derivative torpedoes or giving the German surface ships long lances is quite the terrifying thing. Yeah, that'd be very scary. I think if you wanted to get them to come together to design something that was probably the where you'd get the opportunity for the best hybridization, you'd probably be looking at cruisers. If the Japanese and the Kriegsmarine cooperated on a cruiser design, so you would have something with sort of Japanese cruiser levels of firepower, but German-ish levels of protection and German radar systems, etc. And well, let's face it, German anti-aircraft as well, because forget the Type 93 25mm. Then that would be quite worrying, especially in some of the later night battles like Cape Esperance and everything. Rate the design and potential usefulness of the P-class Panzer ship, says William Kruger. I refer you to my video on the Z-Plan for a more in-depth analysis of that, but broadly speaking, I don't think it was a very practical idea. Yes, they're slightly faster than the Deutschlands, but they don't have the... This is the thing, they don't have the punch to take on the biggest and heaviest ships that can catch them. So Renown, Repulse, Hood, Dunkirk, Strasbourg, and assuming it got finished, Richelieu. And yeah, it's too big a design for the amount of firepower that it carries for it to be useful in the context of the enemies it's going to be facing. it works. It would work okay as long as it's only designed. It's only going to have to face off against heavy cruisers and light cruisers, but it's not going to only have to face off against heavy cruisers and light cruisers, and that is the problem. And ignoring that doesn't really help them. Jeffrey Papiers, if the US had been able to dodge the treaty clause banning the sale of old ships, what would have happened to Java Sea if the Philippine battleships Utah and Florida surprised the Japanese from behind? Depends how close they get, because the one thing the Japanese would be able to do is just motor on away and launch their torpedoes from the other side. But if they are able to, say, catch them from behind and coming in from the opposite direction, so the Japanese would have to do a 180 to get away, assuming they've been all modernized properly, quite a lot of damage, because Japanese cruisers don't take very nicely to 12-inch AP gunfire. Zeraxis, do you have a favourite ship aesthetic in science fiction? If so, which, and what is your favourite ship? Also, would you be willing or able to do a video on naval hull form design and calculation at some point? The latter, yes, I eventually. Again, it is on my list of Wednesday videos to do. It's also something I'm often on looking at in a lot more depth, because I know about Froude numbers and hydrodynamics and a lot of stuff related to naval design and engineering, but at the moment I don't know quite enough for me to confidently do an hour plus video on the minutiae of it. On the other hand, there are a couple of people, both who are either watchers of the channel or people I know in real life, who do know a little bit more than me about it, so that video will probably be something of a collab so that they can offer some more expanded guidance on it. As for favourite ship aesthetic in science fiction, I'm an engineer. I like something that's big, blocky, and looks like it could smash your face in without even firing a weapon. So I'm very partial to things like the Omega class destroyers and the Warlock class destroyers from Babylon 5. I kind of like the Sovereign from Star Trek, but I actually prefer a hybrid design that I came up with in Star Trek Online, which throws together a bunch of different hull modules from the post-Odyssey class ships. I've actually got a model of a 3D printed model of that over in somewhere in my room, the USS Audacious. But yeah, I also, for my sins, quite like the aesthetic of Imperial warships from Warhammer 40,000 as expressed in the Battlefleet Gothic board game. So yeah, you can probably see a trending theme there. I kind of like Imperial Star Destroyers, but to be honest, if you're going to ask me about Star Wars, I'm all about the X-Wings. And original trilogy X-Wings. I'm not so much of a fan of the sequel X-Wings. What's happening? Meijin Warmbogen 12. Battle of Midway, but trade Japan for Germany, giving Germany all the ships Japan had in the area. Does it change the outcome? If they're using the same ships, not really. In fact, it probably makes it worse because Germany has no real idea how to operate carriers at that point. If they're using exactly the same ships as Japan, it's just a case of, well, now we have the Germans and they don't know how to use half of the stuff that the Japanese ships are doing. They don't know how to do combined carrier ops. It's all going to go horribly wrong. Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, that would be my short answer to that, unfortunately. Yes, it would change the outcome. Yorktown probably doesn't get sunk because, yeah. Archangel Glenn, thank you. He's donating in order for the cause for more models like this, which is very much appreciated. Spartani 548, why weren't Anson and Howe redesigned with the 16-inch guns? basically, because that would have been the Lion class, and the reason the Lion class were initially delayed was because they thought there were going to be developmental issues that were going to keep the 16-inch gun from being ready till about 1943, so they paused work on that. If those issues hadn't cropped up, or if they decided to push on regardless, there might have been an argument for it, but with the work on the 16-inch gun in abeyance, it just wasn't there. It wasn't available. But it certainly would have been a good idea. Jade of Arc. Oh, thank you. A donation for the Battleship Model Fund. Oh, that sounded ominous. Duo Cope, did Captain Burke of the USN and his Desron 23 have the perfect battle at Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943, as many seem to agree on? Arlie Burke. Well, there's a reason. Put it this way: there's a reason he has a massive fleet of destroyers named after him these days. There's no. I don't think there's any such thing as a perfect battle, but he certainly has one of the most successful. So yeah. Right. Scooter SJP. It was discussed using explosives to cut loose Bismarck's jammed rudder, but it was deemed too dangerous. If they had nothing to lose, how feasible of a plan would this have been? They had enough explosives to blow the rudder off. That wasn't the problem. The main issue was that, well, one, triple screw design, so they had a propeller right nearby, and two, triple screw design, so the other two propellers weren't too far away. So, yeah. It certainly, technically, it would have been feasible. Yes, they could have blown the rudder off. They probably would have completely crippled their own ship in the process, however, because, well, when your propellers don't work at all, you're not going anywhere, even if you can steer. Coltex 100. What would have happened if the British made aircraft carriers of the G3 battle cruisers? How would they have looked like, and how effective would they be in World War II? Very. I think we've discussed this before, but you're effectively giving the UK something approaching a Lexington-Saratoga-sized carrier, except that they get to design the conversions with slightly more operational knowledge in mind, bearing in mind that given how long it took for Akagi and Kaga and Lexington and Saratoga to actually be completed, on the Royal Navy side they would have had lessons from Furious, Argus, Hermes, Eagle, possibly even Courageous and Glorious as well. They probably, to be honest, they probably would have ended up with that weird multi-flying off-deck system that Courageous and Glorious had. So that would have been a slight downside, but the sheer size of the G3's proposed hull and its speed would have meant that the Royal Navy would have had a considerably larger and more capable set of carriers going into World War II. Although quite who you use them against in the first few months is somewhat questionable, because yeah, I suppose you could turn them into giant fighter carriers. That would be quite amusing. And the other smaller carriers can do strike rolls. Scooter SJP also asked, novels and TV movies often depict space combat as similar to terrestrial naval combat, sometimes including Third Dimension. What things do they get right and wrong in this analogy? Amongst its many flaws, The Last Jedi tries to introduce us to the idea that lasers move in ballistic arcs. Grief. Whoever thought of that idea? Howitzer lasers, whatever next. Yeah, that's something they definitely get very, very wrong. Also, a ship runs out of fuel and magically starts slowing down. Okay. Did someone not teach anybody about Newtonian physics? That's probably the single biggest one that people get wrong, is when a ship loses power, somehow it magically slows down and comes to a stop. That's not how space works. It would just keep going. Okay, maybe it would start tumbling if the thrusters were slightly off balance. But to be honest, if the thrusters are off balance, why did you design them that way in the first place? And of course, there's sound. It depends on the setting. To be honest, when you're talking about space combat, it's very difficult to pin down stuff beyond those kinds of things, because you have harder sci-fi settings, sort of verging more towards things like The Expanse, and softer. I mean, even they've got a certain amount of sci-fi hand waving involved. Then you've got very soft sci-fi settings like Star Trek and Star Wars, and then you've got different eras again. So using that analogy, like The Expanse or Babylon 5 is supposed to be not too far beyond our own capabilities, whereas something like, say, Andromeda or Farscape is miles and miles and miles away up. So between that and the changes in rules of physics of the universe, it's difficult to pick up on that. Somebody asked, I didn't see who, but somebody asked, where did the name Warspite come from? Warspite actually comes from a very old ship name, which was War's Spite. Basically the War's Spite. So you can kind of see where that is an aggressive name. But then you have very strange names around about that period in the sort of 15th, 16th century. You can have something like the War's Spite and Dreadnought in its original configuration as slightly separate words, sailing along ships like the Marigold. And they had some very weird ideas about ship names for that. What have we got there? Werbo Wind asks, were there any Japanese reactions to the Graf Spee, Scharnhorst or Bismarck sinkings? Did they take note in any of their designs? By the time the Scharnhorst was sunk, it was a bit late for the Japanese, to be honest, and I am losing my voice, and this is my last bit of Iron Brew. The Bismarck sinking, if they were going to take anything away from that, it would have been that aircraft carriers definitely had a role in taking out enemy capital ships. Graf Spee was kind of, don't send your cruisers around alone. Miles McCaskill, pre-question, Drac, have you had a chance to watch Greyhound yet? No. No, I haven't. I've been quite busy, unfortunately. It's probably one of these things I'll watch over the winter. Dragonfell, in your most recent Drydock, you discussed your thoughts on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Do you think that theories about poor and or overdue maintenance played a part in the sinking? It's possible. It's certainly possible, but the thing is, it's the kind. I suppose as an engineer, it's the kind of thing I can't directly prove without doing a full investigation, either myself or reading through massive amounts of investigatory documents. But of course, if these are old investigations, they may or may not have caught everything. The thing is, with the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, there's enough that went wrong, or could very likely have gone wrong in those circumstances, that don't involve human errors like that to have sunk the ship. If you'll excuse me, I've just noticed something in the kitchen. I shall be back in a minute or so. apologies. Yes, I could see slight movement, which was worrying me, and it turned out that one of my gerbils had gotten free and had decided that my freshly made bread was an appropriate snack. So containment re-achieved on Kentucky the gerbil. Yes, a very cute little mini fillet of a gerbil, but definitely not to be eating my fresh bread. Archangel Glenn, do you consider it a tragedy there wasn't an HMS Pansy Flower class ship? And also, could you lift the ship out of its mounting? Okay. Yes, it was something of a tragedy there wasn't an HMS Pansy. There certainly have been weirder names in the Royal Navy. It would have got them in all sorts of grief, though, the crew. Right, so let me see if I remember how to do this correctly without breaking anything. There we go, success. It's very, very finely done. Now I have to put it all back. Huzzah! I didn't break anything. Krabby Guy 27. Assuming Agincourt is kept post World War I, what's the best possible refit she could receive if money was no object, and how would she perform and stack up in World War II under such a guise? She was such a long ship, I'd almost be tempted to say turn her into a carrier, but she's too slow. And she's really under-armoured. The best possible thing you could probably have done with her would be to massively refit it with money as no object, massively refit the machinery on kind of a like-for-like basis with updated machinery in the 1930s rather than same power output. Try and get the ship up to a useful speed. That will probably mean sacrificing a turret or two, but oh well. If you're going to sacrifice a turret or two on a ship, and Agincourt's probably the one that's the safest to sacrifice it from. And yeah, try and turn it into a somewhat faster vessel. See, with that level of armour at that size, if you can get it up into the high 20s of knots, I'd actually almost be tempted to use it as some kind of weird super cruiser, because 9-inch armour is not a practical protection in World War II in battleship scale engagements, but something that's still carrying a 12-inch guns and can cruise around at 28, 29 knots would make a very, very useful counter to something like the Deutschland class. And in that role, it would probably do hilariously well. Marinus Crab, is this the same stuff Dr. Clark drinks? Yes, it is. Spartani 548, Indomitable is assigned to Force Z. Would it help? Yes. Especially if it was loaded up with Sea Hurricanes and Martlets. Or just fighters generally. I mean, obviously fighters would help break up the incoming Japanese attacks, shoot down incoming enemy bombers, which is all good. The single biggest thing they could have done outside of perhaps knocking out the plane that scored the lucky hit on Prince of Wales's stern would have been to break up the pincer movement on Repulse, because Repulse was doing very well at dodging everything up until it got pincered, so that would help. Of course, the Japanese may have gone after Indomitable instead, so Destiny's Echo. How would a Montana class battleship fare against a French Alsace class battleship? Very well. It's got the same number of guns and they're bigger, and it's got more armor. Wow, questions coming thick and fast. What are your favourite YouTube channels? Asks Helium Road. Okay, my favourite YouTube channels are on my recommended list. So actually the channel front page does recommend a bunch of YouTube channels. So who we've got there? We've got The Great War Military History Visualised, Steam Geezer and Son, who of course built me this wonderful ship, Military Aviation History, The Shipyard, Dr. Alexander Clark, of course, Napalm Rat is good for a laugh, if you like War Thunder. And if I go into my Watch Later playlist, what else have I got on here? Scalagrim, Scholar Gladiatoria, Wolflord Row, Space Dock, Meta Nerds Lore, Eckhart's Ladder, 40k Theories, Midwinter Minis, Duncan Rhodes Painting Academy, Modern History TV, although that's actually medieval history, so whatever. It's oh, and Jorg Sprava, of course, yes. Oculus Imperia. There's a lot of different videos I haven't watched from some of these people. So yeah, those would be a brief summary of the YouTube channels whose videos go straight onto my Watch Later list when they pop up. Oh, and Todd's Workshop, of course. The reason his stuff isn't on my Watch Later list is because I just watched a bunch of it earlier today. Yeah, very nice chap actually, Todd. Met him in real life. Eric, someone said something and then the questions jumped. Okay, I'm lost with that one. Sorry. Kyle Ned Blake. If you were to design a Dreadnought 2, what would its main guns be and how would they be set up? Depends what era I'm designing it for. I'm designing it for now. Am I designing it for World War II? Yeah. I mean, I would go for... If it was interwar, I'd go for either... I mean, there's the conventional 3 triples, but... If I had all the possible technology, I'd actually be tempted to go for 2 quads forward, to be honest. I think the French definitely were onto something with Richelieu, and Dunkirk and Strasbourg for that matter. Oh, there it is. How'd that happen? Eric 24567. If the USN somehow magically got Des Moines and their necessary supply line in the 1900s, would the Royal Navy be worried, and what would their response be to them? Yes, because a Des Moines in the 1900s can basically destroy anything that sails. They'd be very worried. What their response would have been, probably try and steal it. Because you're not going to beat it in a gunfight. KV222, what capital ship had the worst broadside in World War II? Schleswig-Holstein, because it only had 4 11-inch guns. It's technically a capital ship, so I'm going to get that one on a technicality. Canis Rufus UK asks, Warspite aside, what's your favourite ship, name, Royal Navy and non-Royal Navy? Outside of Warspite, for the Royal Navy, it's almost a grab bag of most of the capital ship names from the 1870s and 1880s because they just went full out at that point. Because you have things like Conqueror, Thunderer, Devastation, and so forth and so on and so forth. It's almost Ian M. Banks levels of excessiveness at that point. Favourite ship names outside of the Royal Navy? I think. Well, the thing is, a lot of the outside the Royal Navy ship names, a lot of them share similar concepts. As like, well, for example, at the Battle of Trafalgar, you have HMS Neptune, you have a French ship called the Neptune, or however you pronounce it in French, and you have a Spanish ship called the Neptuno. They're all literally the same ship, same name in different languages. See, the thing is, for a lot of them, if you name them after provinces or leaders in your own country, I can understand they're going to have a lot of resonance for you and your people, but for someone else, not so much, which kind of rules out a lot of stuff. It's like Bismarck, Tirpitz, Wisconsin, etc. It's like, yeah, that means something to you, but not really so much to other people. Non-Royal Navy ship names. I like, say, like USS Vesuvius is a good one, definitely. I like aggressive names. I like it. It's a warship. It's got to be aggressive. So the more aggressive you make it, or unintentionally hilarious, then yeah, those two types of names I would go for. That's why I was highly amused by USS Dictator. That's a very funny one to me. Some Japanese names have an interesting lilt to them as well, like Shikishima. You almost want to go, oh, look, it's the Shikishima, which probably annoys Japanese people intensely, but I just find it highly amusing. Miles McCaskill asks, during the Battle of the Atlantic, would a destroyer ever use its 40mm Bofors for surface action versus a submarine? Yes, they would. And if so, how effective were they? Pretty effective, actually. A 40mm Bofors will mess up a submarine something nasty at close range, assuming they can not develop. Point downwards enough. There's a D word for it somewhere. I can't remember what it is. Starbuckle, that's a mighty goblet. Wikipedia tells me it's appropriate. It tells me the appropriate toast to a Friday is a willing foe and sea room. Thank you for your videos. Yes, so, well, I would, but unfortunately I'm out of Iron Brew, so this is going to last as long as and my voice does. Paul from Chicago. Who would win in a fight? Yamato, Missouri, Super Vanguard, whatever that is, 28 Tribals, or Megazord Horatio Nelson with Kung Fu action grip? Okay. Since I don't know the exact capabilities of Megazord Horatio Nelson, I'm probably going to go with the 28 Tribals purely because of the stupid amounts of torpedoes they're going to put in the water. Hawker Hurricane, what's your thoughts on how countries are again interested in space travel? Well, it can only be a good thing, at least it will distract them from shooting each other over pointless reasons. And do you think that battleships will make a return in space battles? Possibly. Depends whether or not you can armour your ship against the weapons that are being used. That's basically it. It's if there is a viable form of defense against a spaceborne weapon that a spaceship can mount that is some kind of physical armor, then, like say a Whipple shield, then yes, battleships will make a comeback. If not, then no, because one of the defining characteristics of a battleship is armor. If you have something that's sailing around with lots of big guns, for example, that's actually probably, at least by historical precedent, a battle cruiser. Because if it has little to no armour. Is there data on how much munitions worked versus were duds, and did things get better in World War II and World War One versus World War One? That's David Sladke. There is data, but it is a little bit patchy because obviously if a shell goes into the water and causes a big splash but missed, you don't necessarily know if that was a dud, premature detonation, or a normal working detonation, and you're never going to find it. So there is a little bit of a bias towards obviously counting shells that hit, and that requires information from the ship that's been hit, which in turn requires that it survives. So, for example, with Prince of Wales versus Bismarck, we know that at least one German shell was a dud because they found it on Prince of Wales, and Prince of Wales was still around for them to find the shell on. Whereas with Bismarck, we don't know how many, if any, shells that hit it were duds. With the number of shells that hit it, there almost certainly would have been some, but it sank. So we're not really going to find them, are we? So that's, yeah, there's some partial information, but it takes a while to put together and it's not comprehensive. Right, I am beginning to detect a slight quaver in my voice, so I think probably it's 21:29 now. Let's go for 21:35, so 6 minutes, and I'll try and speed through as many questions as I can. So let's go with that. Should the name HMS Captain return to service for the Royal Navy? No. But that would be a very bad idea given what happened to the last one. And yes, it was been nearly 150 years, but that's still too soon. There's a reason that HMS Hood hasn't made much of a comeback either, for that matter. Although, weirdly enough, they did bring back Invincible. How would Yamato fare against 2 modern US missile cruisers? I suspect they'd have a difficult time sinking it directly, but they would certainly cripple it with massive amounts of incoming missile fire. Because remember, modern US missile cruisers, they can use their standard missiles in a surface attack mode. Stephen Rutherford, how would you design a small but useful French carrier force for World War II? Oh, with French budgetary considerations, for the start of World War II, probably just have to pull in some decent sized liners in the mid-30s and start conversion work. That's probably about the only way they can do it affordably and without completely loading up their docks. Walter Broad US saw a lecture yesterday on Admiral Frank Fletcher. Has history forgotten him wrongly? He gets no credit and has no PR team. Yes, well, to a certain degree. I mean, amongst naval historians, he's not really, I wouldn't say he is forgotten, but yes, compared to the pop culture presence that people like Yamamoto or Halsey or Nimitz have, he has been somewhat forgotten, and he does deserve a lot more credit than he gets in that circumstance. He definitely does need a bit more credit there. Lucas Grand, thank you very much. Felix Catus, how do star shells work? Usually white phosphorus or magnesium. They're basically effectively they're basically flares that you can fire from a gun, and some of them have, a lot of them have like parachute retardation devices so that they float down rather than just arcing through the sky. And I was like, oh, that was pretty. Definitely not something you want to, as actually a number of ships discovered in World War II, not something you actually want to have fired at you because they don't have an explosive component, but they are very good at setting things on fire. Edax, was Shinano always going to be a terrible carrier because it was a battleship conversion? It was always going to be an inefficient carrier. It was always going to have issues with speed and capacity. Basically, it was cargo on a massive scale again. It had more issues because they did it as a carrier maintenance and support vessel rather than a full-on carrier, like cargo, in fact. But yeah, it was always going to have issues. The sheer size might have gotten it through some of those issues, but yeah, conversions are always much less efficient than purpose builds. Can you talk, Robert Ring, can you talk about the super firing secondaries like 6-inch guns on the Yamato? Yeah, yes I can. Not in a 30-second response though, but definitely something to consider when I eventually do a video talking about secondary guns and sort of casements versus turrets versus mounts versus enclosed mounts versus open mounts versus tower stacked super firing secondaries. Definitely something to go in there. To Eddie says, what if Kitakami remained in its torpedo cruiser design sent to Guadalcanal with Kirishima? Can she sink both South Dakota and Washington? I mean, if she's loaded with long lances and gets drops on them, sure. I'd love to see what would happen if someone shot a Kitakami when it was fully loaded with torpedoes, though. Yeah, could go either way. Sean Mack, how's the third destroyer video going along, i.e. that would be destroyers in World War II? It's going. It's going. The fundamental problem with that is that the natural time period with that destroyer video is 1939 to 1945. But so much happens in that time. You've got war emergency flotillas left, right and centre. You've got new designs of destroyers. That much you might just about be able to cover. However, you've also got all the combat that's going on. So I might have to either restrict myself purely to the design elements, or I might have to split it into two and talk about destroyer, like lessons learned from combat, and then designs that were come up with. The only real problem with that aspect is the fact that a lot of the designs, especially the later designs, were influenced by the combat. So yeah, this is one of the problems without turning it into a 2 to 3 hour thing. Scooter SJP, Piron, tires of waiting for the Royal Navy, decides to launch a boarding action, somehow miraculously captures the Bismarck. What is the Royal Navy response when they receive word? Treat the Poles with extreme caution and please bring it into Portsmouth so you can have lots of prize money, I suspect. Eamon, if the hood wasn't kept because it exceeded the limit in 1922, what would the Royal Navy want, or would they get another 35,000 ton ship? Should the Royal Navy go for the O3 class or a battle cruiser? If you're in 1922 and they're forced to get rid of Hood, then the Royal Navy would probably demand a third Nelson. If you're looking at it from hindsight, then they probably should get like a downscale G3 battle cruiser or something like that. Just trying to choose a couple of final questions from people who haven't responded yet. What Coltax 100? What's your opinion on Wall of Warships non-existent ships? Varies depending on the ship, and to be honest, a lot of that, to be perfectly honest, largely depends on how close to reality those ships were. So something that was fully designed up and almost built like a Minotaur, there's a limited amount to complain about there. Whereas something that's completely whole cloth, it allows a little bit, sort of something that was maybe a preliminary or sketch design. It allows a lot of drift because I think, as I've said before, this is the one thing, even when I'm doing 5-minute guides, when you talk about ships that were only ever preliminary designs and hadn't even really gone through full detailed design, they usually end up looking overpowered because all the issues and compromises and everything you have to make in actual warship design weren't done for them because they didn't progress that far down the line. I do think the Royal Navy Tier 10 should be something different though. Royal Navy Tier 10 battleship, apart from anything else. Martian Productions, why did the Indianapolis usually receive maintenance at the Mare Island Naval Shipyards rather than somewhere closer to the Pacific theatre such as Hawaii? There are limited amounts of shipyard facilities in Pearl Harbor, and they're also limited in capability as compared to the shipyards on the continental United States. So yeah, if you need to do any kind of major repairs, go to the continental United States. You keep Pearl Harbor for patch up and immediate repairs as best you can for ships that are coming in that are severely damaged. And they've got big dry docks and stuff, but even when you look at what happened with a lot of the Pearl Harbor survivors, like actually Helena, USS Helena, which was sitting where Pennsylvania was supposed to be. They patch it up in Pearl Harbor, but they send it over to the US for full-on refits because there's just much more and more capable facilities. Nagato 2044, shockingly, is asking a question about Nagato. How important was Nagato to Japan, and what did the ordinary Japanese citizen in the 40s think of Nagato? Of the two, Mutsu was actually the more beloved, at least until it blew itself to pieces, because Mutsu was paid for by public subscription, whereas Nagato was paid for by the Japanese government. But outside of that, Nagato was sort of the leading flagship unit of the fleet for most of the interwar period, and so it did hold something of a special consideration in Japanese minds, because the Yamatos were so secretive, to be honest, they didn't actually know, even the Japanese public didn't know all that much about them, other than they were the latest and greatest. Okay, 2 more questions because I really am losing my voice now. Daniel Rosenkrantz, are you going to make an episode about Danish ships? Yes, I am. Probably in a few months, because I actually managed to get hold of an archive of photos that include a bunch of Danish ship photos, so I can actually have something to put in the background. KV222, what ship had the shortest life in World War II? Actually, HMS Audacious wouldn't be too bad a candidate. I mean, there were a bunch of destroyers that got blown up pretty quickly, but in terms of capital ships, Audacious and Blucher both had pretty short lifespans, although Audacious shorter than Blucher by a considerable margin. I think that's probably about it for me at this point. Because as you can probably tell, I'm now actually struggling to speak. So, yeah, sorry. Drac has run out of Drac voice. Oh no, I need to go find something to drink. Kaiju Director, as a final question, asked, "What's your favourite sea shanty?" It's got to be what are you going to do with a drunken sailor. One, because you can modify it so hilariously. And 2, I was taught it as like a 3-year-old, so memories. I'm not going to start singing memories, but yes, anyway. Thank you everyone very much for being here with 2 hours and 45 minutes of me going on, so we now know roughly what the limit of my voice is. Yeah, I hope to see you all again on a video. Well, the 2 videos coming up this Saturday and Sunday. And I think this month probably will do a middle of the month live stream where I'll just be taking questions from chat. Hopefully it won't be 2 hours 45 minutes though. Okay, now let me find the off button.